Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us today for Alpine University's November webinar. Our topic today is Leave It to the Experts. Can item writing success be predicted? Today we'll be discussing the importance of carefully selecting subject matter experts. My name is Jana Hairston and I work on the marketing team here at Alpine. We'll get started with the presentation right away, but I wanted to go over a couple of announcements first. If you're having problems seeing or hearing the webinar, please first try to close down and restart the GoToWebinar application. If that doesn't work, please email marketing@alpinetesting.com and we'll do our best to help you troubleshoot. We'll leave plenty of time for questions during just about the last 15 minutes of the webinar presentation. During that period, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Raise Your Hand feature located in the panel on the right of your screen. I will unmute the question asker, and that person can then ask questions directly of our presentation of our speakers. Last but not least, we'll be covering lots of information today, but don't worry because we're recording the presentation. So if you miss something, you can always review it once the presentation has been posted to the Alpine website. We'll send out an email in a couple of days with a link to today's recording along with the slide deck for your use. And so without any further ado, our presenters today are Laura Myford-Brooks and Christina Hollowell, Alpine Test Development Professional. And with that, I'll turn it over to Laura and Chris.
Thank you so much. Hi, this is Chris Hollowell. Jana, is everybody able to see my screen? Are we still good on that end from the technical perspective?
Yep, it looks like I don't have anything to troubleshoot right now. No red flags, so you're good to go.
Perfect, thanks. Thank you everybody for joining. Depending on where you're at, good morning or good afternoon. We'll be discussing today, as Jana said, indicators of what could possibly lead to item success. So just go ahead and jump right into it. The agenda that we're going to go over today is we have done a little bit of research leading up to this. I'm going to be discussing the quantitative portion, so all those numbers and charts that gets everybody excited to look at. So I'll be going over that. We'll discuss the method, the results, and the discussion points. I'm going to hand it over to Laura, and she's going to talk about the qualitative data that we have looked at and some conclusions from that. And then we'll do some discussion around maybe how to optimize your own SME recruitment and finish with some conclusions and takeaways. So that's what to expect over the course of this webinar today. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the quantitative analysis. I know sometimes talking about numbers might make people's eyes glaze over, but I promise to make it as interesting as I can. Hopefully you'll get something out of it. Let me first discuss the methodology so you have a little bit of context of where this data originated from. We looked at specifically the item data across beta administrations for 3 different exams. We wanted to keep the variables as consistent as possible. So these exams originated from the same certification program, so they are limited to just one industry. We also made sure that the exams were at the same expertise level. Specifically, this particular SAT was not at what you would call an entry level, but it's also not what you would call an expert. It's right there kind of in the middle. We also made sure that the same facilitator was present for all of the workshops in the item development. That way there wouldn't be some sort of facilitation style that could have been a variable. For each subject matter expert, what I'll be calling a SME from here on out, we looked at 2 main variables. How many items were produced, and of those that were chosen to go to beta, how many were actually kept versus deleted based on those item statistics that came back, or maybe some content issues. Of course, with any study, unfortunately, nothing is ideal when we talk about research and getting things out there in the real world. So let's quickly look at some major limitations that we are recognizing. First off, this data is limited to only one program in only one industry. So maybe a different industry would have had different findings. We don't know this at this particular moment. There is a limited amount of data. We didn't have an infinite amount to look at. Due to that, we weren't able to necessarily stratify the data into different ways to look at it with the variables. So for example, we're unable to consider something we call cognitive complexity. Maybe another way to think about that is the mental processing, how many steps it takes to get to that correct answer. We weren't able to look at that as a variable, so when you think about just remembering something versus critically thinking through an item, that was not a variable we could consider due to the limited amount of data. We also were not able to look at every single item that a SME wrote. We only had statistics on items that made it to beta. The way an item made it to beta was actually pretty random. It was based on blueprint needs, so not all of them were chosen. However, every SME did have multiple items chosen, so at least every SME had items looked at. The very first thing we needed to do was define success. So we really started to look at 3 different things. Initially, we had identified 2 things that we wanted to look at. The first was quantity. Quantity dealt with the number of items produced. In order to be considered a top performer within the quantity category, a subject matter expert needed to produce at least equal to or above the average amount produced for a particular exam. So if an exam produced 10 items on average from each subject matter expert to be a top performer, you had to produce at least 10 or more. Let me provide a little caveat here. For this particular certification program, item writing development occurred in an accelerated 5-day workshop. So for each subject matter expert, there was a very specified amount of time that each one had to produce these items. I know a lot of programs do what would be considered a distributed process, where maybe they are trained and they write items across the course of multiple weeks when they have time. This was not the case. They were all brought in person, and they had 5 days, half of which was spent writing and half of which was spent reviewing. So this quantity is really coming into play there with how much could be done in that limited amount of time. Quality we looked at, out of those items that they produced and went to beta, how many were actually kept? So to be considered a top performer in this particular category, from a percentage standpoint, they needed to have at least equal to or above the percentage average that were kept for the entire exam. So if on average, at least 50% of items that went to beta were kept on an exam, that would need to happen for the subject matter expert. Those initially were the only 2 that I had thought of, kind of pre-analysis, but on the ad hoc side, I got to looking and I was like, wait, there's a lot of people that were only falling into quantity or only falling into quality. There was just this little small subgroup that did both. Those are who I identified as our superstars. They became a top performer in both the quantity and quality. So that became a 3rd definition of success. So let's jump into the findings here. As promised, I have these nice tables with numbers in it that I'm going to show you. And I'm not going to discuss every single number in all of these charts, but I'm rather going to draw your attention to a couple few choice things. So here in our quantity, so these are the top performers in quantity. So this isn't reflecting every SME, but only the SMEs that were considered top performers. You'll notice that in this accelerated workshop, at a very minimum, these individuals were contributing at least 14 items to the workshop. At a maximum, we had up to 38. That's quite a few items in that limited amount of time. However, if you look over here into the percent of beta items column, you'll notice that for some subject matter experts, they might have only kept 35% of those items that went to beta. So then you have to start to ask yourself, even if you have subject matter experts that can initially write a lot of items, if they're not really being kept for the beta, after the beta for the operational exams, how successful are we being? And if you'll notice, across all 3 exams, only one actually, at a very minimum, as far as being kept, had over half. There was one where there was at least one subject matter expert where all their items were kept, but for the most part, that wasn't the case. Exam 3, for example, ranged from 35% to 63%. It's not a very high kept rate. But looking at that kept rate, so here we're looking at our quality. So what items were at or above the mean for our kept percentage? Here, if you look at that percent of beta items that were kept, the numbers are starting to look a little bit better. On the low end, at least 57% were kept versus that 35% that we saw in the other group. You'll also notice that at the high end, our percentages are a lot better. We're getting up to 83% for 2 exams and 100% for the other. And at the low end, they were all over 50% versus just one being. So we're definitely seeing a higher percentage kept rate here. But how many items are being drafted? That's certainly lower. Whereas the other one, they have to have at least 14 to be in this group. We have as low as 4 items being produced by a SME. So on the flip side, even though they're having more kept, if they're only producing 4, and maybe that's 57% kept, oh, we are keeping 1.6 of the items. So that's not very many when you're thinking about bringing in a subject matter expert to your location and paying for the travel and the resources and their time for a full week. So that's what really brought me to the conclusion to look at that little subset, that overlap, those people that fell into both groups. Those are our superstars. These people fell into both. Of course, the numbers are lower as far as how many fell into them because they fell into both groups. But you'll see here that we're getting more of a compromise, a good compromise between quantity and quality. At our low end, our kept percentages are pretty similar, actually, to what our quality group was. Maybe just a hair lower, especially at the high end of how many are being kept. But they're definitely better than what we saw in our quantity group. For our items drafted, certainly starting to see more items being there than just a minimum of 4. You'll see here that, once again, you had to have at least 14 to fall in this group. So we're seeing more of a compromise between getting a good amount of items out, but also keeping a decent amount of those items. Kind of that sweet spot that we want to hone in on. So once we had defined our success factors and identified where those people landed, we then wanted to look at demographics for 4 groups. These demographics were collected through biographical information, so either through resumes or completing a biographical form out at the end of each one of these workshops. And we wanted to look at actually 4 groups instead of the 3 that I initially stated. So we had those quality performers, those quantity performers, and our superstars. But I was also like, well, maybe we want to see if there are any indicators of red flags. People that really aren't contributing to the success of the workshop at all. And those are what I qualified as low performers. And to fall into this group, and there are pretty strict guidelines to get in there. The amount of items produced had to be less than an entire standard deviation below the group mean. So let's say in theory for an exam, you had to produce, the group produced on average at least 10 items per subject matter expert. But the standard deviation for that exam was 4. To fall into this low performer group, you would have had to write 5 or less items, because that would have been more than one standard deviation below the mean. I warn you, the next slide's a little busy with a lot of numbers, but I will be sure to focus on what's important here instead of all of this stuff going on in this chart. So we looked at several demographics, the ones that were consistent across all the people. We looked at whether the employee was internal or external to the particular company where the certification program was at. We looked at job types. So for, was this a type of engineer, consultant, or manager? This was an IT program. So when I say engineer, I'm talking about like a software engineer. Experience not only in current position, but experience in the IT field. And then there's also another slide that discusses three more demographics. Two more. Education level. So what's the highest amount of education that the person received? And then also whether the person was based in the United States or not. So maybe looking at if having English as a first language would be a barrier. One thing that I'll use the internal versus external employee as our example here. If you look across our four groups, we have our superstar, our quality, our quantity, and then our low performers. If you look across that and you focus on our percentages here, you'll see for internal, across the board, it was almost always about 2/3 that were internal. If you look at external, it was almost about 1/3, roughly speaking, give or take. And this was consistent across a lot of the different categories that you would see a very similar shakeout of the demographics across the three top performing groups. So what this sort of leads me to conclude really is that regardless of the demographic, it really just kind of filtered down to each group. So whatever the overall composition of the demographic group was for the entire workshop, it really kind of filtered down. Same thing for over here with our education and whether or not they were based in the U.S. Before we did this analysis, we kind of thought the highest level of education would at least be an indicator where maybe some college would at least help because it might help them be able with grammar and formulating sentences and whatnot. Which if you notice here, even having high school as the highest amount of education, almost 17% fell into that group, just only having a high school education. So really that kind of blew our theory out of the water there. Another thing that I want to point out is that even though we only had 5 people in our low performer group, only 2 of those 5 actually submitted biographical information at the end of the workshop, which kind of maybe points that there's something else going on, maybe some motivational issues or something internal to the person that could be leading to whether somebody is successful or not, because these individuals, over half of them, couldn't even provide us with their resume at the end. So ultimately what we saw here is that really diverse groups fall into all the different categories. So kind of some takeaway points based on this quantitative analysis. Only a subset of top performers excelled in both quantity and quality. So when you're thinking about success, you really have to think about from a program perspective, how do you define success? Because just because somebody can write a lot of items, which looks really good on the surface, they might not be items that are going to help you get your program up and running from an operational standpoint. And just because somebody has some really good items, is it really worth your time to only get 1 or 2 out of them, depending on if you need to have a lot of items in your bank? So you need to think about what your program goals are. When we think about identifying superstars, at least based on this current set of data and our current analysis, we're not able to really identify one resume characteristic that indicates item writing success. Nothing really came out on top there. Maybe that would be different with more data or another industry, but at this current point, that's our conclusions with that. So I certainly encourage that all programs should track your item writer's success. That way you can start to identify who's being successful, and that way you know who to invite to subsequent workshops. If you update your exams every few years, you might not remember that you had a subject matter expert that only gave you 3 or 4 items for an extended amount of time to write items. That would not be somebody that you would want to invite. You want to bring back those people that are bringing in high quality items and bringing in a decent amount of them. So tracking that is very important to the success of your program. But kind of leading to the next steps, if there's not anything that initially we're seeing right off the bat that's kind of a demographic characteristic, whether that be education or experience, if we're not seeing one thing really leading to success, what are some other things that we can identify when we're talking about successful item writers? And Laura's going to talk about that. I'm going to toss her the control.
Thank you, Christina. Once I've got control here, we'll get started talking a little bit about the qualitative data analysis that we also conducted related to this question of, can you predict item writing success? All right. So the qualitative research that we designed was really intended to complement that quantitative result that Christina shared with us. So for Christina's team's research, she was really limited to data on the demographic responses on the bioforms that the subject matter experts turned in at the conclusion of the workshops. The qualitative research was then designed to look particularly at variables that we might not really be able to capture on a bioform. And our hope was that we would find a combination of both these biomaterial variables that Christina looked at, as well as some sort of personality or maybe profile variables that we could use to identify quality subject matter experts. So let me briefly discuss our methodology for this qualitative research. To gather these results, we started by asking ourselves who would have the most exposure to these diverse groups of subject matter experts from multiple programs of many different sizes and locations, etc. And we determined that test development facilitators and psychometricians who also facilitate would likely be the best target for this particular research question. So we designed several focus groups and collaboration exercises to determine if the facilitators first define success the same way. Second, if they were aware of any personality traits that seemed to be common to successful item writers. And then three, if those traits were agreed upon by the majority of the facilitators in the exercise. And so we structured these workshops in a way that was very similar to a job task analysis, which many of you may have participated in or undergone with your programs in the past. So we started by drafting a shared definition of success. What does it mean to be a successful item writer? We followed that with some time to think about traits or characteristics of successful item writers independently. So we had our facilitators and psychometricians draft these lists of personality traits or experience traits independently. Then we gathered the group together to collaborate and discuss and organize the responses. And the final result of that activity was basically a categorization of domains or groupings, and then of individual traits within those domains, and then also examples or enablers, basically, to give additional context to those traits. And we were really looking for consensus opinions, similar to the goal in a typical job task analysis. And the results of the process led us to four main categories: personality traits, professional traits, backgrounds and skills, and then group characteristics. And we'll look a little more closely at each of these now. But before we actually gathered the data, as I said, we took the time to define what a successful item writer really means. And we ended up defining success in a way that was fairly similar to the way Christina's group defined success. We talked about it as a combination of both efficiency and quality. And so we defined efficiency as the number of acceptable items that were created relative to the time spent item writing. So obviously, as you know, if you've participated in item writing before, it takes usually a lot less time to draft a quality memorization or remember level item than it does a very high cognitive complexity, such as analysis or evaluation item. And then also quality, which would be the number or the ratio of items that successfully pre-test to become operational or scored items. And then one additional variable that we identified that Christina also talked about was cognitive complexity. And that has a really high impact on this process. So most of the time, it's quicker and easier to draft those high-quality remember level items than it is to craft good analysis or evaluation items. And so we asked our facilitators and our psychometricians to consider this as they were thinking about those successful item writers. So if someone drafts 4 great analyze and evaluate items in half of a day, that's pretty exceptional. That's a pretty good result. 4 remember level items may not be quite as exceptional. So for the purpose of this research, we were really asking for the facilitators' perceptions of efficiency and quality, taking into account that the efficiency of writing those lower cognitive complexity items will look different than efficiency of writing understanding or application or analysis items. And that leads us to some limitations of this particular research methodology. This is truly qualitative research at this point, so we are limited to the observations of the experts. And at this stage, there are no really numbers to corroborate these results. That will be the next step. It's also possible that different domains may have different desirable characteristics. We tried to diversify the facilitators in terms of their experience. So the majority of them had experience in professional credentialing, education, IT certifications. The weakest area in terms of their experience overall was in facilitation of test development within K through 12 education and higher education, though most had some experience in those areas. Other possible limitations would be that maybe these facilitators have their own personal biases when it comes to identifying these traits. So what's easy for a facilitator to facilitate, those traits may not necessarily correlate with item writing success, but we're hopeful that future quantitative research to validate the findings of this qualitative research will help to eliminate that factor from the analysis. Okay, on to the actual findings of this qualitative research. And again, this is presented in terms of these groupings of traits as identified by the test development facilitators. The first grouping or domain of traits the facilitators identified is personality traits. And these traits included creative, so that's the ability to draft items that are outside of the box. Persistent, so a willingness to work through difficulties to get better. As anybody who's worked with test development before, no one is born an excellent item writer. It's something that requires persistence to get good at. So item writers who are persistent, willing to work through the tough spots, tend to have better outcomes. And this is also highly related to motivation, which we'll come back to a little bit later. One note, at the far end of persistence would be obstinacy, and the group agreed as a whole that that obviously is not desirable. There has to be a moderate level of persistence. The next trait was cooperative. So the panelists identified that subject matter experts who are happy to work with others and whose instinct is to trust the facilitator rather than challenging them from the get-go tended to have better outcomes. And then finally, flexible. So the panelists said it was crucial that the subject matter experts are able to take constructive feedback without shutting down and shutting out the facilitator. And this is related to cooperation, obviously, as well. The whole mind mentality, this is my item and I'll do whatever it takes to save it and defend it, is not very useful in most cases in item writing. Obviously, you need to be able to explain your thought process, but if you refuse to back down or take feedback, that can really decrease the number of items that a group is able to get through in an item writing workshop. All right, the next group of traits that the facilitators identified were professional traits. And the facilitators identified that a broad and sophisticated content knowledge was crucial for item writers, and this was particularly important for those higher cognitive complexity items. So wealth of experience tended to make writing real-world scenarios that much easier. You weren't necessarily having to invent the wheel each time. You could go through your, go into your memory and pull out these scenarios that you'd actually experienced within the field. It was also really important that the subject matter experts be connected to individuals new to the domain. And when this was not the case, the facilitators said that the items that the SMEs wrote tended to be beyond the level of minimal competency or minimal qualifications for the domain. So if someone was very experienced but hadn't really worked or connected with anyone new to the domain at the level of that minimally competent or minimally qualified candidate, they were less able to target those items at the appropriate level of difficulty and the appropriate level of focus for the exam. Next, we have backgrounds and skills that correlate with success. And this is related to the quantitative research that Chris and the other people on her team completed. And our research here confirmed that there wasn't a particular demographic profile of a good item writer that our group could identify. They did identify that fluency in the language of the test was important, but that doesn't necessarily mean advanced grammar skills. What it does mean is an ability to articulate a thought process. So each of the facilitators on the panel had had experiences with SMEs who had learned English as a second language, who were extremely strong item writers. So it wasn't necessarily that you were a native English speaker or very advanced in the language of the test, but that you were able to explain your thought process to the facilitator and to those around you. Next, we have basic writing skills. So it was important that there was basically a concept of basic structure, organization abilities in the language of the test. And then finally, education or training. And it's important to note here that it's not the kind of education that matters. So it doesn't matter necessarily if someone is in an advanced degree program within the domain of practice that they're writing for the exam for, or if it's on-the-job training, or if they've done professional development. It's really about the ability to think reflectively about your job or about whatever the domain is of the exam, and relate your new knowledge to your prior understanding. And the facilitators found that those who had been in an educational setting were more likely to be able to do this, to relate their new knowledge to their prior understanding of their domain of practice. And then finally, the group identified a few group characteristics that correlate with item writing success. So the ideal group, according to our panel of expert facilitators, was a diverse group of subject matter experts that were still representative of the domain, whatever the exam was measuring, a mix of educators or trainers and practicing professionals, a supportive environment where people strongly identified with the mission of the organization, and then also the ability to focus on the work, at the task at hand, and not being pulled out for other responsibilities or having to basically do their quote-unquote normal job while also item writing. That tended to have a very negative impact on the success rate. If someone doesn't feel that they can fully commit to item writing during the time that they're supposed to be writing, they tended to write less. And then finally, motivation, and this is really important. So regardless of any of these traits that were identified, if a subject matter expert is not motivated to do the work, you're not going to get good results out of him or her. So desire to do the work is a really big part of this. And if somebody hates item writing, they just don't enjoy it, you're not going to get good items out of them. Or if someone is voluntold, basically, volunteered by someone else to do this work. Maybe their boss says, hey, go do this for a few days and come back to me when you're finished. They're less likely to feel motivated. So being a part of something that's larger, understanding how their efforts are part of the greater whole of the testing program of the organization at large, that can be very, very important to ensuring item writing success. So now I'll talk really briefly about our next steps in validating this research. To conduct quantitative research to find statistically significant correlations, we're going to need a way to measure these characteristics that our experts identified. And to do this, we've identified a couple of personality instruments that we think will be useful for this purpose. So we're looking at two assessments. They're very popular personality assessments you may or may not be familiar with. The first is the DISC Classic 2.0 assessment. It ranges about $25 to $35 in administration. And then the Strengths Finder 2.0, which is about $15 for the basic assessment. Both of these assessments are really well documented. They've both been subjected to validity research already, though not necessarily for this purpose or in this area. And these instruments were chosen primarily due to their popularity, their accessibility, and their focus on increasing productivity in the workplace. And you may wonder why we're not suggesting that we create a new measurement instrument, so basically an item writing success prediction test or something, for example. Since there are these existing instruments that can measure those variables that our experts already identified through this qualitative research, and since these particular instruments have already been subjected to validity research, it makes sense for us to use them rather than to reinvent the wheel. So just to use them for a slightly different purpose. So we've pre-identified profiles or traits within each of these personality assessments that we think will correlate with the success characteristics. And I'm not going to go through each of those profiles or traits because that's many, many more slides that you're probably not interested in. But if you are, let us know. We can get that information for you. And so our next step will be to deliver personality assessments to a group of subject matter experts and then review their past item writing productivity or success, or present, future, depending on the length that we have to do this research, to determine if the quantitative data support the correlations that our experts identified. And you may be wondering why we didn't start by just giving our subject matter experts these personality profiles and pulling out the conclusions that way. Well, as you know, politics tends to play a big part with exam programs, and finding a client willing to say, sure, give our subject matter experts a personality assessment and maybe we'll find something. That didn't seem like a very viable plan. So having some hypotheses that we're actually looking to prove is a better plan than just throwing data out there and trying to see if anything bites, basically. So that's why we started with the qualitative research first. So how can you use this research? In terms of individual item writer recruitment, think about the dynamics of the group as a whole when you're looking at individuals. Look at personality characteristics. Look for people who are creative, who are flexible, willing to take feedback, experienced. Look at those professional traits. So people who have been in the field for a long time or maybe less amount of time, but they're connected to people in the who are at that minimally competent or minimally qualified level. And look at their background and skills. See if they've been involved in any kind of education, thinking reflectively about the domain of practice before. An important note here is that regardless of these personality traits that we may or may not find do correlate with item writing success, that should not supersede content expertise. If someone has all of these, sort of like a unicorn, has all these great traits that we're identifying, but they're not actual subject matter experts, that's not going to do you a lot of good. So content expertise does need to come first, but all content expertise being equal, look for some of these personality characteristics that our facilitators identified. When you're building your cadre of item writers, your group of item writers, try to collect as diverse a mix of item writers as you can that's still representative of the domain. Isolate them from other responsibilities as you can. So if you are in a situation where folks are going to have to be doing their regular job while they're also item writing, you're not actually physically taking them out of that scenario, talk to their supervisors, make sure that the supervisor knows how important this work is and that it's important to be able to focus on this task at hand and not focus on the other job and write items on the side. Do your best to manage group dynamics. Make sure that's a positive feeling. Make sure overall people are feeling good about their participation in the program. They're not feeling like this is a duty or a punishment. And finally, create a culture of motivation. Make sure there's a culture of ownership so people understand how important their individual contributions are to the group, to the exam, to the program, to the domain of practice. Their work is going to impact this exam and the domain of practice for many years to come. And too often we see programs who aren't actually expressing that to their subject matter experts, that this is not just a one-time thing. Their work will have long-ranging consequences for exams. Try to cultivate a feeling of group belonging and prestige. So make it a prestigious thing to be selected to become an item writer. Make sure that there's a perception of appreciation. Make sure it's not a thankless job. That can be between and among the item writers themselves, so that everybody has a positive feeling of encouragement rather than, oh, that item writer really stunk. You're not very good at this, are you? But also you personally, and maybe as a program manager, make sure that they know how thankful you are that they are participating in this project. And then finally, some groups have the option of compensation, and compensation can absolutely increase motivation. Do I think that it guarantees it? No. Do I think that you have to provide compensation to your subject matter experts to get good items? No. But if it is an option, it can certainly help, and it's something that should be explored if you can do that. And now just a couple of notes on how to optimize subject matter expert recruiting for item writing and review. So we have a great term that we learned from one of our clients who is the subject matter expert recruiter for her program. She provides gentle, relentless pressure. So she never strong-arms her subject matter expert. She's never, rude or anything like that. But she is kind of always there in the background trying to say, can anybody do this? Can anybody do this? That gentle, relentless pressure. Think about creative outreach. Try to contact those subject matter experts directly. You may have a hierarchy that you need to go through if you're recruiting within your company or something like that. Of course, we're not suggesting that you necessarily go outside of any of those prescribed outreach programs that you already have, but do try to get creative. Ask your subject matter experts if they know other people who they think would be excellent item writers. Build this community of advocates. So again, as we said before, reward and recognize SME contributions, not necessarily participation. Anybody can participate, but if somebody is really going above and beyond, make sure that that's rewarded and recognized. Create a little bit of competition, obviously a healthy level, not anything that becomes a negative experience, but if someone's really exceeded their goals, make sure the other folks know that. Make sure they know that the bar is fairly high so that the baseline of performance is basically raised. Finally, if you can do these things, your subject matter experts will become the champions of your program. It'll raise the awareness level about the program. It'll raise the quality of people who are willing to participate in the program, and it can have really positive impacts for item writing. So your ideal subject matter expert item writers will be a diverse group. If you can get global participation, if that's relevant to your particular domain of practice, try to do so. Get folks in a variety of job functions if that's relevant. Get different levels of experience and expertise. They're going to see things differently. You don't want just all very high level 30-year in the job experts. Someone who's been there long enough, a long time, might do things differently than someone who's newer to the domain. And then think again about the necessary skills. So subject matter knowledge, they need to be able to write and review, have an appropriate ego, nothing that's too out there, nobody that's too shy, the ability to have fun, and finally motivation, as we said before. Motivation really is key to having a positive experience with your subject matter experts. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chris to very briefly wrap this up with some takeaways.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. All right, so I'm just going to very quickly synthesize pretty much everything that we said and then get this to the Q&A portion so you have time for that. So kind of going back and really just summarizing what we found in our research. At this stage in our quantitative, and we do plan to hopefully get some more data and spread that out and see if this would still be the case in the future, but as of right now, there is not a magical resume checklist. Rather, all the 3 successful groups had diverse demographics, which this actually confirms what a lot of people already knew, and that is that you need a diverse group of subject matter experts. But this kind of stretches more into a lot of different areas that maybe you hadn't thought of before, not just diverse as in what maybe people's ethnicities are, where they're located regionally, but a lot of other areas such as experience and whatnot. It could go beyond demographics. There could be specific traits, and those traits have been identified qualitatively, where those things could be correlated with item writing success, and they can range from personality traits to professional to background and skill traits. Ultimately, though, the group dynamics matter. The sum of those individual parts are really what you're going to get that good group of people in the room to get a successful workshop. Some takeaways, some things that you can use in your own program. Make sure that you know what success is. Make sure you have an idea and a goal of what your success is going to look like, and make sure that you're recruiting based on that. Make sure that you're tracking that performance. That way you know who to bring back. Start to be able to identify what types of individuals are contributing to the success of your workshop. Don't just focus on those demographics. You really need to start to think about some of those internal factors. Those really do play a role. Maybe consider those personality instruments. It could be a good tool to identify roles for subject matter experts. We still need some of that quantitative research to verify that, but it's certainly an avenue that you might want to consider. Do anything and everything you can within what's reasonable to increase your item writer's motivation. That's where the core of a lot of the success is going to lie. And ultimately, build a community. You want to have SMEs want to be part of the program. Laura referred to a program client that has had a lot of success recruiting, and they have been so successful that they are now in a stage to where they have to turn people away because they come wanting to be part of it. That's what you want. That's what you want to happen. So that wraps up our portion. So we'll hand it to everybody else that's on the line and see what questions you have, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you so much. And Jana, let me know if I need to toss anything back to you to give you control, or if we're good as is. Jana, did we have any questions? I'm not sure. Jana, I think that's Jana messaging if she can be heard. I am not able to hear you. So we might be having a little bit of audio difficulties. Our apologies.
Well, since we're not able to have Jana let us know if there are any questions, if anybody does have a question, please feel free to send us an email. I will add our email addresses to the chat box, and we're happy to answer any questions you have about your particular program, your particular SME recruiting strategies, item rating success, anything. And we want to thank everyone for their participation today. We hope you found this useful, and thank you so much for your time. Christina, anything to add?
I don't think so. I apologize for that audio glitch there, and please don't hesitate to email us. We'd be more than happy to respond back. So thank you. And Laura, are you going to put that in the chat box there for us?
I sure will.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I know that it's valuable, and we are so happy that you came and spent it with us today. Hope you got something of value out of it.